has been noted already more than once this morning, the world is changing for Canada. And our first panel discussion will help us walk through this shifting global landscape. And to help us do that, we're joined by Marta Morgan. I invite Marta and the first panel to make their way up to the stage by the left of the stage. Oh, behind me, actually. There we go. Oh, it's all good. Marta Morgan is a senior advisor with McMillan Vantage, former Deputy Minister, Foreign Affairs, also former Deputy Minister, Immigration. Marta also served as Vice President at the Forest Products Association of Canada and was PPF's first strategic advisor to the President. She holds degrees from McGill University and Harvard University and joined the Public Policy Forum as a fellow in 2024. Marta.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a real privilege to be here today to kick off the first panel of the 2025 Growth Summit. It's wonderful to see so many familiar and friendly faces in the audience. We are in a very turbulent time with the geopolitical uncertainty and volatile trade dynamics. And that has really prompted a national discussion about what we need to do in Canada to build our own economic growth and our resilience in the face of all of this. And we've got a great panel here today to talk to you about that subject. We have, starting at the far left, Michael McAdoo, BCG Partner and Director. Michael has had over 25 years experience at the intersection of trade, corporate strategy, and geopolitics. Cynthia Leach, the Assistant Chief Economist at RBC, leading RBC's thought leadership on structural economic and growth issues. And David MacNaughton, Canada's former ambassador to the United States and also former president of Palantir Technologies Canada, who has also spent his career at that intersection between public policy and economic growth. So I think we're going to have a great discussion, and I'm going to kick us off with a question first to Michael. Michael, you've traveled the world. You are responsible at RBC for trade strategy. You work with companies everywhere in the world. How is Canada seen by our trading partners and by our potential trading partners?
Well, thanks, Marta. It's great to be here, and thanks to the forum for this invitation. Yeah, within BCG, I live in Montreal, but I co-lead the practice for BCG globally. So just to dimensionalize that, last year I worked on 77 projects with our teams in 28 countries, so get a real view. In French, we say, nul n'est prophète dans son pays. No one's a prophet in their own land, so it's great to be on a stage here in Canada. And I think, in general, so I work in the world of trade and investment, and Canada is, very, very well perceived. We did an analysis at BCG about 18 months ago. We looked at over 800 free trade agreements that have been signed, and there's a database at the World Trade Institute at the University of Bern. And they looked at all these trade agreements for breadth and depth and coverage, and we cross-tabulated that with the level to which these trade agreements were being used by the different countries that had signed them. And we ended up with kind of 4 segments of countries. And Canada was in the most interesting segment. We called it the free trade stalwarts. So these are countries that had a wide range of trade agreements that were quite broad and deep, with dispute settlement and covering services and things like that, but also highly used in terms of percentage of trade. So we were in the company of countries like Singapore, Mexico, Chile, and the European Union. There was another group that had trade agreements, but they didn't cover a lot of their trade, and actually the US was in that group, called opportunistic optimizers, and also the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. And then there were the targeted allies like Vietnam and Korea that did very specific deals, but they didn't really cover a portion of their trade. And then these kind of independent movers that really didn't have a lot of trade agreements and just tried to make their way, like, say, China and India. So from that perspective, I think we're in a good club of countries. And then when you look at kind of the results that we're getting on that, I had the team pull some data. So looking at Canada's trade with the world, 2012 to 2024, so the past dozen years, with the world we grew at 1.7%. But with CETA, so the CETA countries of the European Union, we grew at 2.9%. So something's happening there. It's getting up. The TPP countries, also known as CPTPP, if I can say that, 2.2, so again above the average. And the US also growing slightly above the average, but only at 1.8%. So there's a minor amount of diversification happening. But the problem is the US is still north of 60% of our total two-way trade, and that's the challenge. And when you look at what drives trade, of course, The economists talk about the gravity effect, so size and proximity. But I did a little bit of research on some of these distance attributes that go beyond that. So Frankel and Rose, a couple of academics, looked at what drives trade, and high income drives a little bit, size of economy, geographical distance, but actually common border, common language, common trade bloc, and a common colonizer or colonizing relationship actually drive trade much more. And that's what we have with the United States. We have all those attributes plus the size and proximity. So I think diversification is going to be a huge challenge for us, but I think around the world people are ready to work with us. It's just hard to get there from here.
Great. Cynthia, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think all that's true. I think adding to that in terms of the way that Canada is viewed is we're in a difficult time, but it's important to remember that Canada is a very rich country. Canada has a very highly skilled labor force, strong institutions, things that matter more in the current environment. I think we cannot underplay those. But it's, we have a great network of free trade agreements. It's always been a challenge, it seems, for Canada about translating those very strong inputs into strong outputs. And that's where it's, in the current environment, we're receiving a trade shock. It's important the conditions we're in. We have some structural weaknesses that's going to make surviving this trade shock and getting through it more prosperous, more difficult. And that's where Canada's going to need to work harder.
David?
Yeah, I think the other thing is, historically, we've had a number of sectors in the economy where our companies were strong and were out finding new markets. And so we used to be the center for the mining industry, and we had a whole lot of mining companies that were based here. Forest products, we still have some good forest products companies, but a lot of them have made huge investments in the United States. And so when you talk about trade diversification and you look at some of the companies that have got products and services that could be exported, a lot of them are not of the size to be able to take on that kind of an effort. And so somehow or other we have to find a way for governments at all level to be supporting some of these small, medium-sized companies who've got products and services that could diversify, but it's really challenging for them to go other than to look at the United States as a market.
Great. These are perpetual challenges, I think, that we've had in Canada, but the current situation that we find ourselves in is extremely motivating, and both, I think, to government and businesses. Have you seen, in the conversations that you've been having with Canadian businesses, have you seen sort of evidence of that, and that companies are really starting to think more seriously about this and to take action?
Well, I think you've got, it depends on what sector you're in. I mean, obviously, if you're in the automotive business, right now you're thinking about how do I survive for whatever period of time this continues. And there are companies, and I saw in my old job with Palantir, that a lot of large Canadian companies were very slow at adopting technology compared to our Canadian or our US counterparts. But a lot of the small and medium-sized companies, particularly owner-operated companies, were embracing technology and saying, we're not only going to make our competitors, we're going to be able to beat our competitors in Canada, but we're looking globally. And I find that really encouraging. And I hope some of our larger companies actually, rather than simply throwing a lot of money at their IT departments, figure out how technology is changing the world. And that's one of the ways in which we can diversify our exports, is adopting technology a lot faster than we've been doing it.
Great. Okay, I'm going to kick off the next topic with Cynthia. Cynthia, we're going to rely on you to keep us honest by focusing on the data, because you're very data-driven. RBC's done a lot of work around Canada's growth challenge, as well as the impact of recent tariffs. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about what do you see as the key drivers of future growth for Canada, and also our resilience in the face of these tariffs.
Yeah, well, I mean, job one is clearly to fight the tariff shock, so to speak. I mean, Avery probably gave you a pretty good rundown. I didn't hear all of it, but a quick summary, no data points, but the narrative is, Canada's firmly in a tariff uncertainty shock. We're seeing it in consumer and business confidence. That's starting early stages to show up in the hard data. What's coming is we're going to, in our forecast, we're going to see a slowdown in the US and most forecasters as well. And like all the time, that's going to have a feedback effect into Canada. So Canada, we have some very weak growth this year, and next year, sub 1% growth. And those two things layer on top of each other. And remember, these are not necessarily one and done. The uncertainty shock could definitely have a long tail. And we don't know where trade policy is going. And so, the conversation has shifted, fortunately, in the last couple months from Canada-specific severe shocks, 25% broad tariffs. And, but there are arguments on all sides. There's very even probabilities across the distribution of what could happen with trade. And so we have to be prepared that there could be a more significant shock down the road that in our modeling and others shows that Canada could be facing, a pretty big recession. So, over a couple of years in that case. And so it's about addressing the tariff shock first, and that's going to mean businesses adjusting their supply chains, finding new markets. It's going to mean, we don't think monetary policy is the best tool here. Often it's going to be fiscal policy, and it's importantly going to be negotiating a new deal for Canada with the US administration. But I think the key point here is that in being caught up fighting the immediate challenges, we're going to forget about the longer term. And so I think the key going forward is how do we embed that longer term thinking toward export diversification, towards shifting from goods to services trade, to taking advantage of some of our opportunities. How do we start to embed that in things that we're going to be doing to fight the tariff shock in a fiscal policy response and how businesses adjust?
Michael, what do you think the priorities should be from a policy perspective to build Canada's economic growth and resiliency in this current context?
So I think, when you look at just what companies are doing, right, it's not like capital's flowing into the US right now. There's so much uncertainty. I don't think a lot of capital's flowing into Canada. People that have assets on both sides of the border are trying to modulate across that, but I don't see a lot of our clients, saying, I'm going to automatically open a factory in the US just because the president says there's going to be long-term tariffs. I would say that when you look across the world, of course, everyone was surprised by the extent of those so-called reciprocal tariffs. Now we're back to this 10% baseline. What I tell clients is the only two places from which you can ship a product into the US market without paying a tariff are still Canada and Mexico, if you're CUSMA compliant, right? And so there's a little bit of daylight there that getting that figured out correctly is going to be a key to building the market access for Canada and attracting that investment and maintaining that investment that's here. So I prioritize that. But under no circumstances would I think that that's a done deal. And we have clients around the world. I'm working with some governmental clients in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and they tell me, well, we'd like to do a deal with President Trump. What would that look like? And I say, well, Canada and Mexico had a deal called CUSMA. It was 2,200 pages. Steve, who negotiated, is here in the room somewhere. I think that's before annexes, Steve. And in that, you had a dispute settlement resolution mechanism, and you had a renegotiation or review clause after 6 years of entry into force. Neither of those clauses included a stipulation that you should put 25% tariffs on your neighbors to build leverage in a negotiation. So even if we get that right, I wouldn't only rely on that. I think we've got to come back to making sure that we can operationalize the market access we have through those trade agreements, right? There's a whole host of domestic industrial policy. We need to work on the productivity problem. But fundamentally, as I see it from a trade perspective, it's about getting that CUSMA renegotiated as best we can and keeping Mexico on board with that, please. Let's not try to do a bilateral. That's not good for us, I don't think. And then make sure we can operationalize the agreements we have and potentially do more. We're missing some things with India, with Indonesia, some other large emerging economies. We're missing things on the African continent if you're thinking longer term. But I would focus on those things.
David, what do you think from an economic perspective to drive economic growth? I mean, we know that we have the immediate urgency of resolving the trade issues, but we also know that, last year we were here talking about productivity and Canada's long-standing productivity challenges, and now that's taken on a sense of urgency that I don't think any of us expected.
Well, I think, there's really a sort of, I would say, a three-track approach to this. One of them is obviously we have to try to do whatever we can to resolve the issue with the Americans and the tariffs that are on and everything else. And that's going to be difficult because, you know, a deal isn't necessarily a deal with Donald Trump, as we've seen. But I think there are ways in which we can get to a better space than we are. The second one is to, as others have said, to look at diversifying our markets. And the third thing is really to get our act together here in Canada. And you know, I remember very well when I was in Washington and began a discussion early on when I was there with the US about critical minerals. And I said, you know, you guys helped start our aluminum industry in Canada because you needed the aluminum for your jet planes. You need our critical minerals now. Why aren't you helping us, you know, whether it be do take or pay or loans or grants or whatever? And the answer that came back was, David, we'd love to, but you know, we need the minerals before 2050 when you get them out of the ground. And I think, you know, as a country that is a really improbable country in the sense of the size of what our population was and even is to this day, and a huge geography, the way in which we built this country was to do the improbable, in cases some people would say impossible, built railways across the country, and we've lost that. And so we need to find a way to get governments at all level, working with the private sector to focus on outcomes and try to, as I say, get our own house together, because I think even just doing that, and this goes to interprovincial trade barriers, but there's a whole series of things that let's not get totally distracted by that guy south of the border, but you know, work on that, but also figure out, you know, this is a huge opportunity for Canada to actually do some things that we've been neglecting for a long, long time. And I think those can make a huge difference in our productivity and our economic growth, even notwithstanding what Donald Trump may or may not be doing.
Cynthia, what do you think what
Yeah.
would your to-do list be?
I'll jump on that, and actually I think it addresses the first question also on the slide. I don't know if other people can see it, about like what's led to our productivity dropping, well, you know, relative to other countries. Well, there's a lot of factors, but a key thing is private business investment. We have, you know, lagging business investment. That's compared to the US, which isn't always a fair baseline, but even relative to some other peer economies, we've not been investing enough to drive that productivity, and so that productivity gap has opened up. And if you think going forward about the stools of Canada's potential growth, so what the speed limit of our economy is, as we colloquially call it, it's, you know, think of the factors of production. It's capital, it's labor. Well, what's happening on the labor side? We've, you know, had very strong immigration growth, and now we all know, I think, that we can't rely on increasing immigration levels to drive that potential growth. And so it puts more weight on the other side, the capital component, which means, you know, investing more capital per worker. It means different types of capital, so more innovative technologies that can mean we, you know, maximize the use of our capital and our labor. And, you know, to go to the critical minerals point, you know, when we think about that, you know, production function, you know, intermediate inputs are kind of like one of those things you don't really think much about, but they've become incredibly important in a polarized world where people are fighting over these strategic resources. And we've written some work in our thought leadership colleagues about how, you know, Canada has a bunch of these things, you know, and it's not just critical minerals. We have important energy resources in agriculture, in potash, in uranium, all these other areas. We got to think about how to, you know, use that as a platform for driving investment and, you know, furthering or normalize our relationship with the US, but also expanding our opportunities globally.
Great. Thank you. Did you want to add anything, Michael?
That's good.
No. Okay, great. So David, question for you to kick off. I mean, you've been speaking recently about the changing world order and where you see things heading. And you know, I think providing Canadians with a really sort of realistic perspective on that. And, you know, maybe you could talk a little bit about that and what you think Canada needs to do to assume the position that we need to be in this changing world order that we find ourselves in, and how that relates to the economic actions that we need to take to build our own strength and resiliency.
Yeah, well, I think we have, if you look at all of the multilateral institutions that were created, some of them immediately after the Second World War and some of them after that, they have preserved our global peace and security ever since the Second World War. I mean, obviously there's been some issues that have arisen, but they've worked pretty well. But at the present moment, most of those organizations, most of those institutions are either dysfunctional or have lost an awful lot of credibility. And I think we should not abandon multilateralism, but I think we've got to think creatively about what are the new kind of institutions and organizations, and do they have to be permanent, or are they, various gatherings of the willing around issues or around things? I know when, when I was at school, we didn't belong to the OAS because it was dominated by the Americans, and we didn't want to do that. And then, I found in Washington that we were working very closely with a lot of the South American and Central American countries on some issues like Venezuela and others, where they wanted us to participate. They didn't want the Americans there. I remember sitting with a group of ambassadors from those countries, and we were meeting with a couple of senators, and one of the senators said, we have to be careful, we're dealing with this Venezuela situation because, on occasion, the U.S. has militarily or politically intervened in this area of the world. And one of the ambassadors said, yeah, 72 times at last count, And so I think the all of the turmoil and the moving of the United States from, much closer to the isolationism and protectionism that has ebbed and flowed in the United States over the years presents an opportunity for Canada to step up. And as I say, it's not saying, well, we should take a bigger role at the UN or at the WTO or whatever. But I think we need to be opportunistic where we've got real strengths and build those kinds of alliances, and they will too end up providing opportunities economically for us. And so, we shouldn't just say, oh, well, the WTO doesn't work anymore, so we're going to forget about all that. Let's think about, because I think with the United States retreating, and make no mistake, that was happening before Donald Trump. Donald Trump tapped into it and amplified it, but that mood was happening in the United States, and I think it gives Canada an opportunity to, up its game on the international stage, which will also create opportunities for us economically.
Michael?
Yeah, I think David's right about the importance of trying to maintain those institutions, but I think we're moving to a dangerous new phase in international relations. If you look at the history of international relations, beginning of the state system, Peace of Westphalia, 1648, we've had periods of multipolarity. We had a period of bipolarity in the Cold War, a period of essentially unipolarity after the fall of the Berlin Wall and opening of China. And we're going back to multipolarity, but it's a multipolarity that's unbalanced. So the US, of course, is stronger today in absolute terms than it ever was, militarily, economically, technologically, et cetera. But in relative terms, the US has not been this weak since the 1920s. And as much as they're trying to throw their weight around in the global trading system, they're still less than 20% of total global trade. So the rest of the world is going to find ways to work together. And in that, you've got a rising China, you've got a rising India, right? You've got a bunch of middle powers. You've got a European Union that doesn't know what to do because it was relying on three important tailwinds for 2 generations, which were a US defense guarantee, cheap Russian gas, and access to the world trading system. Those tailwinds are gone for Europe, so it doesn't know what to do. And so Canada, as a slightly smaller power, but still an important power, will have to navigate a much more complex international environment, which I think will be inherently less stable than what we've seen for the past 2 generations.
Yeah. Great. I'm going to take one question from the Slido, the currently most popular one, and then I'm going to have one last question for all of you. So, question: does the fact that we're currently in the best trading position with the U.S. with Mexico compared to the rest of the world work against us in terms of trade diversification?
I think so. It's the gravity. And when Michael said, it's not guaranteed one and done, well, also it's not guaranteed that that's going to be stable if we get that new agreement with the US. So we can't lose sight of that long term and have to find opportunities to diversify in it. It's going to be difficult.
I think we'll be less complacent going forward, even if we do get USMCA or CUSMA done correctly.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so one last question for our panel. I'm sticking very closely to our timeline here to catch up a little bit of time. So my last question for you is, what's the one big thing that Canada needs to do in the current situation to invest in our future economic prosperity?
Yeah.
There's a lot of good answers here, I think, but I'm actually going to say that there's a lot of little things we need to do. So that's one thing I want to highlight. It's about how do we engage business investment so that entrepreneurs, day-to-day people are taking those risks that are going to drive Canada forward in the long term. Because it's easy to think about big solutions, but sometimes you need the little things as well. And then the other thing, I'm going to steal another one that I think is really important that we start thinking about. We're going to be spending a lot of money in certain areas of the economy, like we have to, housing, aging, healthcare, defense, and we got to think about how to turn those into more innovative sectors for ourselves too, to drive growth, because the fiscal balance sheet isn't unlimited, our capacity to do everything isn't unlimited, and so things that we're already doing and have to do, we need to think about doing that better.
Great. Michael, do you want to go next?
Operationalize those free trade agreements we have and get new ones done with India and Indonesia.
Okay. David?
Well, when Donald Trump threatened to tear up the U.S. The NAFTA agreement, and there was a real sense in this country that we had an existential threat to our prosperity. And what happened is that the country pulled together. And we were able to, put aside regional differences, political differences. We had, I remember I met with every premier. I went right across the country. I talked to business groups. There was a remarkable degree of unity of purpose. And, I think that was an existential threat. We face an even bigger one now. And so finding a way to have government and business and labor and, all segments of our society working together. And, you can still have disagreements and differences of opinion, but we can't be fractured in terms of our approach, because if we're too small as a country and as an economy, that's the only way it's going to happen. And I think that if you look at what's happening in Canada right now, I've never seen the degree of patriotism and the elbows up thing and everything else. But I think whoever gets elected on Monday, we need to find things early on that illustrate that the government of Canada is thinking about every part of this country, and we're not trying to, divide, regardless of who has what number of seats in what part of the country. That unity is going to be essential.
Okay, so pull together more free trade agreements and take all actions, large and small, with the perspective of building long-term economic growth for Canada. Thank you very much to our panelists. Enjoy the day.